Later on today, we'll be seeing President Trump participating in several discussions and events. But tomorrow, we are looking ahead because he is set to meet with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy. The Associated Press saying this: with a fragile Israel-Hamas ceasefire and hostage deal holding, President Trump says he's now turning his attention to bringing Russia's war on Ukraine to an end and is weighing providing Kyiv long-range weaponry as he looks to prod Moscow to the negotiating table. Ending the wars in Ukraine and Gaza was central to Trump's 2024 re-election pitch, in which he persistently pilloried President Joe Biden for his handling of the conflicts. Yet, like his predecessor, President Trump also been stymied by President Putin, and he's unsuccessfully pressed the Russian leader to hold direct talks with Ukraine's Volodymyr Zelenskyy to end the war that is nearing its fourth year. We're going to talk about all of this, really the implications of the meeting tomorrow, but also something that we saw yesterday, which is the fact that several defense ministers that are part of NATO held talks in Brussels, Belgium, to really focus on Ukraine and the support they're willing to provide going forward. So joining us now to discuss all of this is Mark Timnitsky. He is a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. Mark, good to see you.
Good morning. Thanks again for having me.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, we had you on a couple of days ago before the NATO defense ministers met in Brussels. That happened yesterday. So Mark, we kind of previewed what that meeting was going to be about. The focus continued to be Ukraine. What were some of the biggest takeaways from all of those defense ministers and their talks?
Well, first, during the meeting, prior to it beginning, there was an opportunity for Secretary of War Pete Hegseth to speak to everyone, and he repeated several points that the United States had said, both when the defense ministers met in February earlier this year, as well as the NATO summit in June, saying how European members of NATO and the European continent as a whole needs to do more to help Ukraine during Russia's ongoing war. Something that he discussed too is that it's imperative for these countries to continue providing and prioritizing aid to Ukraine, which will, as a result, make the war end sooner. As a result of making types of those comments, countries such as Estonia, Finland, and Sweden all pledged that they would provide more assistance to Ukraine by purchasing additional weapons from the United States, which suggests that Secretary Hegseth's message is being clear to the European allies, as well as the plan that President Trump proposed back in July of this year about selling U.S. weapons to NATO countries in Europe, who would then send it over to Ukraine, is working. There were also some commentary about large countries such as Spain, Italy, the United Kingdom, and France, who have large financial abilities to spend in their budgets as well as with defense, are not doing enough. And there was commentary that countries with larger GDPs need to do more for the European continent. Aside from that, Secretary General Mark Rutte of NATO made similar points and comments that he's made at previous NATO gatherings about the need to strengthen NATO collective security, national security. Ukraine is a priority for NATO countries, defense of the European borders, and things like that. Then finally, there was an opportunity. The European Union that same day, yesterday, spoke about the need for creating a drone wall, which is something that NATO has been exploring as well. And they think that they will be able to finalize these technologies to be able to protect European and NATO borders by the end of calendar year 2027. So those are some of the points that were discussed during the NATO Defense Minister Summit on Wednesday.
I want to put up this post here courtesy of NATO, as I was also showing some of the footage from yesterday and the opening remarks of all of those defense ministers. NATO saying this, though: as efforts to secure a just and lasting peace continue, NATO's support for Ukraine to defend itself today and deter aggression tomorrow remains steadfast. And then a couple of hashtags there, including Stand with Ukraine. Going back to the involvement from the United States, the partnership there, Mark, we had talked a little bit about how some of that support from the U.S. going to Ukraine has dipped over the last couple of months. In fact, it's courtesy of some of the reporting of the Associated Press. So what kind of strengthening was made with Secretary Hegseth there talking to the other defense ministers? How did those conversations go, and what exactly were some of the pledges that were made by the U.S.?
The United States said that it would continue selling weapons to NATO countries, which will then be used to be supplied over to Ukraine. But the United States is also repeating some of the points that were made during the 2024 presidential campaign last year, where the United States thinks that it should be stepping back and not as heavily involved with the Russian invasion of Ukraine as countries in Europe. And one of the thought processes is that Ukraine is a country in Europe. A lot of these members within NATO are also part of Europe, and it's a lot easier to transfer weapons more efficiently and quickly, as well as providing assistance because this war is happening on their continent while the United States is several thousand miles away.
Also bringing up here post courtesy of NATO as well. This is NATO Chief Secretary General Mark Rutte saying this, quote, NATO is a defensive alliance. We will remain a defensive alliance, but make no mistake, this defensive alliance is ready and willing to do what it takes to keep 1 billion people safe and our territories secure. As we continue to listen into some of the remarks from Secretary General Rutte here, he remains confident and optimistic when it comes to the partnerships that have been established within NATO and all of the security that is going to provide to all of those NATO members. How does Secretary General Rutte continue to keep that alliance very close? What are some of the strategies that he has been using just to make sure that everyone continues to be on the same page?
Something that was proposed during the June NATO summit this year was the increase of defense spending from 2%, which was proposed in 2014, to raising it up to 5%. That was implemented here, which is a goal for NATO members to reach by 2035. And several countries were hesitant to agree to that because of the large financial burden that that would perhaps do on countries, even though it's necessary to defend their national security as well as security across Europe. But what Secretary General Rutte did as a compromise is they broke it up into two categories. That 5%, 3.5% were the things that someone would think about defense being: weapons, vehicles, infrastructure needed to provide that. But then the remaining 1.5% of that 5% would be the cybersecurity abilities, or being able to keep hold of military capabilities or soldiers in the area. And in addition to that, aid to Ukraine that NATO is sending has been included as part of that 1.5%. So as a way to try to lessen the burden that it would be on several countries that have stated that it would be very difficult to reach 5% in 10 years, these were some strategies to try to make it easier for those countries.
I'm filtering through a lot of these social media posts. I'm going to bring yet another one here onto the screen. The U.S. ambassador to NATO saying this, including a photo there with Secretary of War Pete Hegseth. NATO is in the deterrence business. Under President Trump's leadership, all allies are increasing defense investment and sharpening their military capabilities. The world was reminded of this at NATO's defense ministerial, and which is something that you have been talking about a lot, Mark, really this kind of pressure from the U.S. to make sure that all of these NATO countries do step up in terms of defense and also helping to support Ukraine, which brings us into our next topic of discussion and what we're looking ahead to tomorrow. President Trump meeting with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy. They have met a couple of times since President Trump has stepped back into the Oval Office. First one, a bit contentious. The second time we saw them, it got a little bit better. How has their relationship progressed from the last time both of them met to now? And in terms of where the war stands right now between Russia and Ukraine, what are some of really the key issues that they're going to focus on?
During the presidential campaign last year, President Trump had it as one of his top priorities to end Russia's ongoing war in Ukraine, and he has been trying to do that ever since he took back in the Oval Office in January. Since February of this year, the United States has been meeting with the Russian counterparts as well as the Ukrainian counterparts over a series of meetings to try to come up to an end to the war. And the Ukrainians have regularly met with the United States talking about the need for an end to the war. They've been very open to the United States about what types of weapons that they need to try to push back Russia's ongoing offensive. And one of the capabilities that they've requested is the usage of long-range missiles. And why that is important for the Ukrainians is it would allow them to strike military targets deep within Russian territory. Something that has been happening over the last few months is the Ukrainians have been using drones to target these capabilities because they don't have the missiles and long-range firepower to hit these areas. And these missiles would allow them to target places such as ammunition depots or weapons factories or Russia's energy infrastructure. And these are key areas because energy is used, gas and oil, to power Russian tanks, Russian vehicles that are transporting soldiers. Weapons factories, of course, create weapons that the Russians are using for the war, and then ammunition depots are used to put bullets in those guns and other types of ammunition for the tanks and the missiles and other defense capabilities that the Russians are using. So that's what they've been pushing forward. On the Russian perspective, they said that there's a need for a ceasefire several times, but they have not held up their agreement. For example, the United States tried to broker a ceasefire back in March of this year, where Russia and Ukraine would not be able to strike the energy infrastructure because it was still the winter months. Russia agreed to this plan, and then international media such as Reuters or the Kiev Independent and Newsweek were reporting that since that ceasefire was implemented on energy infrastructure in March, Russia violated it 30 times. Similarly, during the Easter and Passover holidays in April, Russia proposed a ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine so that people could observe these important religious holidays. And several hours after Russia implemented its own ceasefire, it violated the ceasefires in Ukraine by bombing numerous cities. So these are some examples where the Russians have said that they want a ceasefire, but they're continuing their attacks. And most recently, ABC News has said that the last few weeks, Russian increases in drone strikes and missile strikes in Ukraine are unprecedented, and it's the worst that has ever happened during the war. So these are some examples of how the war is escalating while the Ukrainians are continuing to work with President Trump. And by continuing this dialogue, it has made their relationship stronger as a result.
It really just showcases, as you mentioned, how important this meeting is tomorrow for the trajectory of this war. Going back to some of this weaponry that we're talking about, that's really going to help Ukraine amidst this war. And taking a look at yet another social media post, Mark Rutte here saying, excellent discussions with defense ministers reaffirming increased defense investment, enhanced defense production, and stepping up support to Ukraine. We will also implement additional counter-drone measures. NATO is ready to do what it takes to keep our 1BM people safe and our territory secure. Mark, before I let you go, and I don't want to get ahead of ourselves because the meeting between President Trump and President Zelenskyy still has yet to happen. This is just merely a preview as to what we could see and what may be the most important and top of mind. But is there anything else that you feel you want to add for our viewers as we look ahead to this meeting, and also maybe just from what we learned during that NATO defense ministers meeting just yesterday?
Well, President Zelenskyy was on Fox News this past Sunday observing the ceasefire proposal that President Trump had implemented for Israel and Hamas. And President Zelenskyy was saying that he is hopeful that if that ceasefire holds, that President Trump will be able to implement something similar between Russia and Ukraine. And President Zelenskyy said that he is thankful for continued U.S. support and assistance during Russia's ongoing war, and he's hopeful that there will be positive outcomes from tomorrow's conversation.
All right, Mark Tynitsky, he is a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. We do appreciate your time. As I mentioned, we had you on a couple of days ago to talk about that NATO defense ministers meeting, and then today to preview the meeting between President Trump and President Zelenskyy. So a lot still that we have to keep our eye on, and we'll look forward to checking in with you soon. You take care.
Thank you again.
Of course. We're going to step away for a quick commercial break here at LiveNOW from Fox. There's still a lot more to get to on this Thursday as we take a live look here over the White House in Washington, D.C.